Great. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Target Test Prep's MBA Resume Workshop. My name is Joanna Graham, and I am one of the senior MBA admissions coaches at Target Test Prep. I have worked in higher ed and admissions for over 20 years with with over 500 candidates at this point, guiding them to putting together applications for their dream business schools or business programs. I also spent about a decade working at the Graduate Management Admission Council, where I was the product manager for the GMAT exam. So while this is not a GMAT or a test prep workshop, certainly very well read with the tests. And certainly if you have questions at the end of tonight's session, I'm happy to touch on those as well. But today we are going to be focusing on your MBA resume. And I'm guessing if you are here, that means that you probably have some questions about the differences between a corporate resume and an MBA resume. But would love to kind of get a sense from folks if you could maybe weigh in on the chat and let me know sort of where are you in the process right now. So I'd love to know maybe where are you dialing in from? Are you thinking about round one or round two? And just sort of where are you in the process right now? And then obviously feel free to drop in your questions in the chat as well. And we'll try to get to as many of those as we can today. While folks are doing that, I did want to just take a moment and talk a little bit about Target Test Prep's other services. So Target Test Prep started off, as you can imagine, as a test prep company, as the name might suggest. But as you can see, they provide a variety of different programs, whether it's self-study courses for those of you who like something that's a bit more self-paced, live classes, as well as private one-on-one tutoring for both GMAT focus as well as GRE. And more recently, last year, they launched admissions consulting. And so as I mentioned, while I do have over 20 years of experience in the space, sort of working with clients, the admissions consulting is a newer service for Target Test Prep, but a space that we're certainly excited to enter into. And what we really do believe is that, for those of you who are leveraging Target Test Prep for test preparation, TTP really can become your one-stop shop for your entire admissions journey. So just a little bit of an overview of our agenda for today. So we'll talk just a little bit about holistic admissions, what holistic admissions actually means, and sort of how different pieces of your application are going to ladder up into the process. And then we'll really start breaking down some of the differences between developing an MBA or a B school resume versus a corporate resume. What are some things that you want to be thinking about when it comes to updating your resume for an MBA? And then we'll dig into some actual resumes and sort of look at some before and afters, and then talk about some do's and don'ts. And then we'll open it up for questions at the end. Fantastic. So it looks like we've had a handful of folks between round one and round two. We've got folks dialing in from all over the country. Welcome, Austin, Texas. Welcome, New York. We have a lot of folks who right now also look like they are planning to be applying. Round one. Fantastic. You all are just right on time for all of this. I think we have one person who's dialing in from Japan. I think you might win for furthest today, and also some West Coasters. So wonderful. Thank you so much for joining, and we're really just excited to have you here today. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about holistic admissions. And chances are, regardless of where you are in the process, if you haven't come across this term already, you probably will at some point. And this is really just a fancy way of saying that business schools look at a variety of different factors when they're evaluating candidates for an MBA or for a specialized master's program. And what that means is that every piece of the application counts. And so I've included a list here of all of the things that they're looking for. Obviously, professional experience and academics are going to be at the top of that list. The big questions that a school is going to be looking at are, number one, do you have the professional experience to really be a strong contributor in the classroom? And probably hand in hand with that, do you have the academic potential? Do you have, in particular for many programs, the quantitative chops in order to survive and thrive in the program, particularly when I say survive, oftentimes that can be the rigor of a first-year quants. And so those are really the two first things that they look at. Number one, they want to take a look at your undergraduate GPA. If you have completed another master's program, that's certainly something that provides them with a more recent data point. And then specifically, they're also going to look and see what type of courses you took. And so it's not to say that it's better to be, it's better to come to the table as a computer science or as an economics major versus an English major, but they really want to see, did you challenge yourself? How did you perform in those courses? And if there were some blemishes, because I know for many folks, it can be a tough transition starting an undergrad program when you're 17 or 18 years old. They are also looking to see, did you grow? Did you evolve? If were some missteps, were you able to course correct? And so, I will tell you right now from working with a lot of candidates over the years, who were perfectly imperfect, there absolutely are ways to overcome a lower GPA or other blemishes you might have on your transcripts. And we can certainly, if we have some time at the end, we can certainly answer any questions around that if folks have them. Test scores are one of those big items that have been hotly contested and debated, especially coming out of the pandemic. So as most folks know, test optional really became a huge thing during the pandemic, since it was difficult to take standardized assessments. And many schools have remained test optional, but more and more schools are adopting either GMAT focused, the GRE, or the executive assessment, or the EA, as part of their admissions process. And I think that the decision about whether or not to include test scores or whether or not to apply for a waiver is certainly a very personal one. But one of the things that I do make sure that folks realize when they are starting this process is that if, for example, you do have a low undergraduate GPA, a high test score, particularly a high quant score on one of these exams, is a great way to demonstrate sort of mastery of certain skills and competencies. And more importantly, it really gives business schools a much more recent snapshot of your ability. So if you are concerned about something like an undergraduate GPA that was a little lower than maybe a reported average, a good test score is certainly one way to help mitigate against that. The next two here, extracurricular activities and community service, really go hand in hand. And for anyone who went to school here in the U.S. and for undergrad, I'm sure you probably remember filling out those lists of 10 activities on the Common Application and having to come up with description to really give schools a sense of what types of things you were interested in high school. And the reality is, for business schools want to understand how you are choosing to spend your time outside of work, essentially. And so the reason that extracurriculars and community service become important, because it gives a school a sense of what types of interests and passions do you have? How do you choose to spend your time? And perhaps more importantly, what type of community member are you going to be if and when you show up on campus? Are you going to be the type of person who shows up, who goes to class, who goes to the library, but doesn't necessarily engage, is not necessarily a strong community member or cohort member, depending on the model of the program? Or are you someone who's going to lean in and truly be a contributing member? You're going to try to leave the university better than you found it. And that's really one of those things that universities are trying to assess when they look at the types of activities you're coming to the table with. I think it's also important to think about the diversity of those activities as well. And certainly, for many of the folks applying to business school, recognize the fact that, folks are working incredibly, incredibly difficult or rigorous jobs. So maybe you're working 50, 60, upwards of 70 hours a week. And so it can be difficult to find time to commit to extracurricular activities. We'll certainly talk about that when we talk about activities on the resume in just a little bit. But know that there are some other creative things you can do to try to show that you have interest outside of your core day-to-day job. Another thing here is alignment with a school's mission and values. And what this really means here is, when you think about what a school's brand is, essentially. And so if you look at a school like Columbia Business School, if you go to Columbia University's About Us page or their mission page, they lead with the fact that they are a leading academic institution that is focused on research. It is very, very heavy on the focus on academics. It's going to differ by, when you look at every school, but there are some schools that come out sort of right out of the gate and say, these are the things that we value. And so one of the things that I do encourage students and clients to do as they start the school research process is to spend some time, obviously, on the website, learn about the school, but make sure that you are spending time taking a look at what the school's stated mission statement actually is, what their values are, what they espouse to be important. I think another way to really glean some of these things is also by taking a look at social media postings, whether it be through LinkedIn or Facebook or Instagram. But you can really start to get a sense of what are the things that the school values, what is their culture like. in different ways that you can align with what they are sharing. When you think about brand, when you think about sort of fit and creating sort of a personal brand for your application, and this is something I talk with my clients about a lot. I think, brand can sometimes be an overused term, but I do think that there's a lot to be said about having a very distinct and clear point of view or perspective. And that is something that's going to come through in your essays, in your interviews, and even in your resume, quite frankly. But the idea is that, when you think about sort of the brand or the image that you're trying to build or portray, I always encourage folks to think a little bit about this idea of, what are your areas of expertise? What are the things that you're really good at? And then layer that with what are the things that drive you, or what gives you purpose? What gets you out of bed in the morning? And then finally, this idea of authenticity, which I'm sure everyone has heard about. But that really, when it comes to personal brand building, authenticity really gets to this idea of what makes you authentically you. And so a lot of exercises that I'll work on with my clients on try to layer those things. So as you probably can imagine, there's no lack of management consultants or finance folks applying to business school. I'm going to guess we have a handful of folks like that joining us today. But when you start thinking about the things that drive you, so what in addition to finance really sets you apart from others? Do you spend your weekends working on social justice initiatives? Are you maybe you have a soft spot for animal rights. And then the authenticity piece, again, if you were to ask your best friend, if you were to ask your parents, your coworkers, how would they describe you? What are those things that really make you authentically you? That's when you start really developing that very clear, distinct point of view and perspective. And that's something that's going to come through in your application very strongly. Next, soft skills. And again, this is something that I'm sure that many of you have sort of read up on it and are thinking about, how do I incorporate this? So how do you show intellectual curiosity? How do you demonstrate leadership and grit? The essay is obviously a great place for this. So as our interviews and letters of recommendation are going to be another great place for you to have folks speak to some of these. But this is one of those things that can be hard to quantify, but schools are really looking for folks who are coming to the table who are intellectually curious, who have demonstrated leadership, or perhaps if you don't have demonstrated experience as a leader, have great potential for leadership. But also are going to be able to be, flexible, adaptable. Business school in many ways is an exercise in being or getting comfortable and being uncomfortable. And so are you able to adapt and flex based on the situation? And then finally, the interview. And obviously the interview varies school by school, but this is going to be a key component as well in sort of assessing sort of how everything else comes to life and how you present yourself. So on the whole, this is just, like I said, it's a fairly consolidated, a brief list of the elements of an application. But I do think it's a great reminder to everyone that, everything that you're going to be working on for this application is certainly going to count. And again, sort of that first item up there, the professional experience, this is what we'll be diving into a little bit more deeply today, and how you tell that story through your resume. So when you think about a business school resume versus a corporate resume, one of the first things I always encourage folks to think about is, number one, you don't want to use the same resume. And I think this is one of the biggest mistakes that I see clients making, is that they either, when we start chatting about the application, they say, I could use help with interview prep, I could use help with essays, maybe a little bit with letters of rec, but my resume is good. I'm just, I'm not even going to worry about it. And then when we start digging into the resume, we realize that there is, I help folks to see that there are things in your corporate resume that you probably need to reframe for business school. And the reason here is, for a corporate resume, what you're really just trying to do is you're trying to prove to someone that you are capable of doing the job that you're applying for, that you are qualified. In many cases, you're going to talk about sort of mastery of skills and various competencies that you have that make you qualified to do the particular job. Whereas for business school, what you're really trying to do is you're really providing a framework and a roadmap for your application. This is going to be one of the very first things that an admissions officer looks at. And for anyone who's being interviewed, this is really going to provide the roadmap for that future interview. And so what you want to think about is thinking about how does your resume tell a story? So what have you done? How has your career evolved? If you have pivoted, if you have breaks, if there are things, how do you explain that within the context of your resume? And then I think it's also important to really think about the audience, and this will certainly come into play when we talk about sort of building out those bullets. But for corporate resumes, you're typically, your audience is going to be an HR recruiter or maybe the hiring manager. You may be, you may be tailoring your resume for very specific jobs and roles. Or particular industries. Whereas for business school, you're going to have an admissions officer reading your resume and potentially an interviewer, whether it's either a student or a recent alum or someone actually employed by the university. You're going to have folks who aren't necessarily subject matter experts in what you do. And so it's important to make sure that you're able to write and communicate in a way that will be easily understood by anyone. I think one of the things to think about too, when you start differentiating between your resume and your essays, because they obviously are mutually symbiotic when it comes to your application, but the resume really is the what, and the essays are going to give that sort of three-dimensional life to the application. The essays really are going to be the why behind all of this. All right, so let's start talking a little bit about the actual elements here. So for professional experience, some of these things are probably basic and fairly intuitive, but I think it just goes without saying. You want to make sure that number one, you're listing all of your roles chronologically, starting with the most current one. What I would suggest is that for folks who have spent fewer than 3 months in a role, and that doesn't necessarily include internships, there certainly could be a conversation about whether you include them or not. But it is important to make sure that you are including all of your work experience here. That being said, when you think about the number of bullets that you have for each of these roles, bullets really should be commensurate with the amount of time you've spent in a role. So if you have been in a role for 3 years and you have 5 bullets describing the work that you've done in that particular role or that particular company, and then you also have 5 bullets for a 3-month summer internship that you had between, say, junior and senior year of college, or maybe after you graduated, there must either be something really great and significant about that internship, or but more likely than not, there's going to be a little bit of a disconnect. And so you really want to think about, being very deliberate with what you are communicating. Again, the resume is the what. So what did you actually do? One of the exercises that I do with clients when we're going through resumes, and also something that I do with some of my coaching clients who are applying to future jobs, is I always ask them, if you're applying for a job and it's something that you really, trying to decide if it's really worth it or if you really want it or not, start by writing the resume bullets in your head. So as you're going through the process, really think about what, at the end of the day, what do you want your resume to say 6-12 months from now? And I think that's a great way to, number one, think about why you took, sort of the why in some ways behind why you took some of these roles and what you were hoping to get from it. But it's also a great way of really starting to prioritize and be very specific and deliberate about what are the things that you truly are proud of in that role, especially if it's a company where you have been there for a bit of time and you're trying to be be a bit more concise about what you've done. For some lesser known organizations, it can be helpful to include a very brief description. And when I say brief, the focus here really is on brief. And what I would say here is, if it's obviously if it's a well-known brand company, obviously no one needs a description of what Amazon or Google or what Bain or McKinsey does. But for some lesser known organizations, particularly for folks maybe who are coming from a startup, it may be helpful just to include a line in italics that includes a very brief description of who the company is and maybe what industry they're coming from. When you think about these bullets, you really want to focus on impact. And what that means is, every bullet really should be able to pull together sort of an action-oriented verb to basically says what you're doing or what you did, what was the goal and what was the result. And so when you think about that, wherever possible, you do want to try and quantify results. For many folks, I understand you can't always quantify them, but if you're able to provide some qualitative information as well too, that can certainly be helpful. But anything just to give the reader a little bit of a sense of scope and a little bit of a sense of sort of what was the result you were able to drive in that particular role. One of the things you want to think about as well is making sure that, especially if you're coming from, for example, the tech space, that you're removing any technical or industry specific jargon. One of the exercises that I have clients do before they finalize a resume and submit it, I call it the grandparent test. But frankly, I think you could probably ask anyone who's not necessarily coming from your industry. But I encourage folks to share a copy of their resume with someone who isn't necessarily going to know much about your industry. So more often than not, that could be a grandparent, maybe it's a parent, but give them a copy of your resume and see if, even if they don't understand everything that is in there in terms of what you did, the language should be easily digestible and they should be able to give you a high level summary of what you actually have done in your roles. And so that's a great just sort of gut check to make sure that you're staying on track and that you're, more importantly, that you are really clearly communicating what you have been able to do. It's easy to hide behind technical jargon. It is much harder to try to boil down what you actually have done into sort of more vernacular. For those of you who have maybe fewer than 3 years of work experience, or for anyone obviously who might be in school and is thinking about a deferred entry program, such as like a 2+2 program. When it's relevant, you certainly can include internships. Obviously, if you are still in school, definitely make sure to include every internship. But again, the same rules apply here. You should be focusing on impact. You should be writing bullet points that really describe what were the tasks that you were given and what were the results that you were able to drive here. So again, professional experience is obviously going to be the sort of the bulk of your resume itself. And again, it'll, I think, be a little bit more apparent once we start running through some examples. But this is some high level guidance just to start giving you a sense of how to frame the bullets that you're going to be drafting. Let's talk a little bit about volunteer experience and some of the other elements here. So as I mentioned before, extracurriculars and volunteer experience are great because they really do demonstrate how you're choosing to spend your free time. What are you interested in? What are you passionate about? Very much like professional experience, you can certainly list these roles chronologically. For many folks, they will have a separate section on their resume that is titled either relevant leadership or volunteer experience, and certainly include anything that you feel is relevant. A lot of folks, especially if you're less than 6 months out and don't have a lot of this type of experience, folks will sometimes ask, is it worth starting to do something and throwing it on my resume, even if the admissions committee sees that, that it is fairly new? And what I would say is, if there's something that is relevant to your interest, potentially maybe your post-MBA interest, especially if you're looking to pivot, it certainly can help. Because if nothing else, it may help to sort of validate the sort of your interest and your reasons for wanting to pursue that career pivot. But more often than not, again, it's important to really just think about how it's tied to your goals and, more importantly, to sort of your personal brand and profile. Some of the things that I do suggest to folks, if you are working in a job or in an industry where it is incredibly difficult to find time outside of your day job to do this type of work, I think it's important to take a look sort of internally and see, are there other work-related initiatives that you can get involved with? Or are you already involved in some of those? So anything like affinity groups, I think are great initiatives, or great, or sort of things to get involved with in the workplace, particularly if there's an opportunity maybe to mentor or to get involved in supporting maybe more junior employees or other folks within your organization. Again, you want to be thinking about what those bullets are going to be. So if you can write the bullets in your head, if the purpose is to demonstrate leadership potential, then it's a win-win. But I certainly wouldn't encourage you to just go and sign up for anything for the sake of adding it to your resume. You really want to think about how that's going to appear and how it's going to align with the rest of the story that you're presenting, not only in your resume, but obviously within your larger application. For education, I would include obviously graduation year, your GPA, any relevant awards and honors. This should not be a very large section. One of the other things that I would consider in including would be, especially if you worked during undergrad to help pay or fund any of your undergraduate education, that can be a nice detail to include. If you were responsible for paying 30, 40, 50%, or maybe even more of your tuition. It's something that can sometimes help explain perhaps why there maybe isn't as much volunteer experience or extracurricular work or activities, but it's also something nice to sort of indicate to a school that that you are very good at multitasking and have been able to do multiple things. The last section here is it's sort of the broader catch-all, and this could be interest, additional information. So this manifests itself in a couple of different ways. So a lot of folks will include sometimes a technical skill section where they'll include things like certifications or the fact that they're very experienced in things like SQL, for example. Um, there's also, I think there's also a place where for folks to include sort of different passions and interests. And I've seen everything from, interests like cooking and skiing to Krav Maga, and you name it. What I would say about the interest is, you have very limited real estate on your resume. And so what I would encourage you to think about is if it if it truly is an interest and something that you've been involved with for an extended period of time, then certainly feel free to include it. But I wouldn't just include interests that are probably things that are shared by many other people, just for the sake of including it. And so I would think if that real estate could potentially be better spent on something else or better devoted to something else. And the reason here is, and it goes without saying, but unless you have at least 10 years of work experience, and if folks here are applying to full-time programs, which it sounds like everyone on the call tonight is applying to a full-time program, there's absolutely no reason that your resume should be more than one page. And so you do want to be very deliberate in terms of picking what actually makes it onto your resume and what is going to, for lack of a better term, to be what's going to be left on the cutting room floor. So do think long and hard about strategically what are those passions, what are those interests that you're going to be including, what technical skills. Certainly things like a CFA certification, for example, would be something that you'd want to include. That's where it demonstrates a level of accomplishment and achievement. But again, I would think twice about what types of interests and activities you're including, if that space is maybe better spent talking about other professional experiences that you've had. All right, so let's spend a little bit of time now taking a look at a couple of sort of bullets from a couple of different roles and industries. And so the first one up here is consulting. So if you take a look at the original text here, as you can see, this is someone whose the role was they were junior level associates, so they were someone who was 2 years removed from undergrad, and this was their first role. And so as you can see here, they've made good use of action verbs, although everything here sort of is everything here is essentially a gerund with ing. So one of the things that I would recommend is when you think about verbs, again, you want to pick good action verbs that really give a sense of the things that you did. But if it is a current role, make sure that you are using present tense. So manages, conducts, facilitates, etc. And you can see here that they've obviously done quite a few things. So they're managing products, they're leading teams, they're making sure that things are getting done, they're doing research. It looks like they're working with external clients, and it looks like they're having a role in potentially in some business development, winning and extending, renewing contracts. One of the biggest challenges here, though, is that there are absolutely zero metrics though with these bullets. And so for this particular client, when we were working together on this, I said, this is fantastic. You've done a ton in 2 years, and it's obvious this person was up for promotion. So it's obviously that you're up for promotion, and you will probably receive that because you have done quite a bit. However, I have absolutely no idea for scope. So I have absolutely no idea how many projects you've led, how big have the team's been, how many contracts, was there a dollar value attached to that? In some cases, were you able to save the firm money? When you talk about working directly with a CEO or a C-suite, what does that actually mean? And so what is the nature of the work that you're doing? And so when we rewrote this, as you can see here, the updated text. So, built a database. So the managing projects, conducting research, competitive analysis, those first two bullets really came to life here because we were able to say, this person built a database, and it included over 150 critical data and analytics reports. I recognize, especially in consulting, you're often limited in what you can share based on the clients that you're working with. And so sometimes it's, I think writing a resume is an exercise in creativity in terms of figuring out how to say as much as you can without giving away too much. But you certainly can talk about things like in this case, interview 50 stakeholders, including 5 C-suite executives. I think that C-suite detail is important because it shows that this person is able, especially as someone more junior, is certainly able to manage up and have, and certainly have those conversations, be well respected. And then obviously created, these capability maps. And so was able to take the feedback and the intelligence and turn that into a report. In this case, they also won a contract extension, talked about earning a 100% increase in total project revenue. And then I think this last one is probably one of the more impressive ones here. So identified an opportunity for $50 million in cost savings. And more importantly, the result here, because they identified this, because they teed it up, the client is implementing this opportunity. And so it shows that not only was the individual able to identify an opportunity, apply a dollar amount to it. So this shows what did they do, what was the goal, and then what was the result. So the client's actually implementing this. And so it shows that they're really having a direct impact in their role. So the next one, let's move over to finance now. So this particular individual was a VP of finance for a global company, and so as you can see here, there is a lot of text here. There are a lot of bullets. And to be candid, when we first started working on this particular resume in this role actually had 11 bullets, believe it or not. And this is for a role that someone was in for 3 years. And so I pulled out a couple of these so we could focus on this a little bit more intently. But as you can see here, there are some bullets here that talk about leadership and guidance, supporting a team of 25 professionals. It looks like there's some redesign work, so some change management potentially. Cross-functional collaboration. So really, this idea of sort of developing strong, engendering trust, developing strong relationships across the organization. And then you can see a couple of metrics here. So unlike the first one, so increasing and diversifying debt portfolio by over $1 billion, generated $5 million in annual interest expense savings. So you can see again some metrics here, but again, there's still a lot of text here, and it feels like some of these bullets are could be a tad redundant. And so you can take a look now at the updated text. What we did here was we really tried to roll some of these bullets up into and sort of consolidate them into just a couple here. We highlighted, when they were working with external clients, growth strategy on a $10 billion client portfolio, managed various relationships that included a certain number of, banks, agencies, and vendors, and then led an effort to drive profitability by a certain amount. This led to a $100 million reduction in savings of $10 million in expenses. So again, very clear, but really crystal clear and leading with the more impressive results they were able to drive here. So next up, I wanted to highlight a role also that, when a lot of times folks will ask, if I have significant work from college, should I include it? And again, I think the answer is going to be it depends. Number one, it depends on the industry that you're in. It depends on the nature of the job. But I thought this was an interesting piece of experience. So I had a client who had worked as a resident advisor in college, and you can see here he had included these bullets here, and so he was doing a lot. And for anyone who lived in a college dorm, I'm sure you remember your RAs. They probably had one of the hardest and most thankless jobs on it at the university. But in this case, this person was overseeing a handful of other RAs. So there was some mentorship and some team development here. So this is a great way to show mentorship. They were doing some social media management, managing the official Instagram accounts. They were doing some operational work because it looked like they were improving the check-in process for students moving onto campus. And then also a bit of finance work here. So they had a budget that they were responsible for. They had to track expenses, and then they had to find ways to cut costs. So some decent experience here. It's obviously a little bit rough and not a whole lot of metrics here. But here's what we were able to do with this. So once we started doing some digging, we found out that, part of the, wrapped up in this sort of a bullet around sort of enhancing positive staff dynamics and improving logistics, it turns out that this person actually designed and launched and led 5 marketing campaigns. And so they did everything from, creating copy for digital signs, print emails across social media and emails as well. But the idea here was to really push information out and get students to do certain things. In this case, we found out how many residents that they actually managed. So they oversaw 75 residents and an 8-person team. This is fantastic experience for someone to have at the collegiate level. As you can see here, they were working on management, consumer relations, and if you think about that, your customers are going to be those 75 freshman residents. Obviously, there's a lot of conflict management and professional communication. So again, great skills that this person was developing. And then as you can see, they also under sort of the operations piece, ran some successful programs. They averaged 5x student attendance compared to other programs. So they really figured out what type of content is going to resonate. And how do they keep folks coming back? And then lastly here, conducted a department-wide social media audit to take a look at how engagement rates on dorm Instagram accounts were affecting engagement. And I think one of the most interesting things here, again, with the results and the impact piece, there was someone who had reached out about the research and asked to include the findings in a larger report. And so they rolled this up into something much bigger, but it ended up actually being presented at multiple higher education conferences. So it shows that this person really was doing a wide variety of things. And for someone who was looking to go into marketing longer term, this is great because you're covering everything from market research, a bit of finance. You obviously, with building and launching campaigns, you're talking about a lot of creative, but there were so many skills that they were able to build and develop while in college in this particular role. They just weren't really being clearly articulated before. And so I would encourage you, if you have things like this as well in your background, these are great things to kind of unearth and see if you can map things that you've done earlier in your career to much more sort of hard skills, especially if you're thinking, depending on the industry, you're thinking about either pivoting into or moving into beyond business school. And then lastly, I wanted to include something from tech as well too. So as you can see here, the original text. So this was something coming from out of a tech startup. So they negotiated a licensing deal, and then a similar market data deal. Helped to design an app and built a dashboard. Worked on some data transmission processes, and then figured out how to outsource and automate to improve efficacy of certain processes. And then if you take a look at the updated text here, so you can see that not only did they design an app, they recognized the need. There was a market need for something in financial markets. They developed a tool, and it was obviously very tailored to this particular industry. And then they were able to, there were some metrics here about what they were able to sort of increase compared to competitors. How do they leverage AI and ML to optimize? So that sort of speaks to some of the efficiencies here. And then, with regards to that first bullet around the licensing deals, what the licensing deals enabled them to do. So again, what did they do? What was the goal? What was the result? The purpose of those licensing deals, it enabled the product to launch, and it reduced go-to-market time by 75% and cost by 50%. And then finally, this financial bullet here, I think, is great as well. Is they grew that customer base, and so obviously business development was sort of a key area that they worked on as well. The year-over-year revenue growth of 34% is fantastic to be able to share as well. So as you can see, there are so many different ways to really breathe some life into the bullets as you're drafting your resumes. Again, not every bullet, as you can see here, is going to have necessarily quantifiable metrics, but it is important to sort of answer the so what question at the end of the day. So like, what is the purpose of including this particular bullet? What purpose does it serve? And what does it show that I was able to learn and accomplish? Right. So as we wrap up, I did want to just sort of highlight some do's and don'ts. So one of the things as you are getting started, I do encourage folks, excuse me, to think about, before you get started working on essays, working on letters of rec, parallel track the work on your resume with this. So don't wait until the last minute to just think about your resume as an afterthought. Parallel track this with the ideating around your personal brand, your narrative, your essays, your letters of rec, everything. And the first step in that is inventorying all of your experiences. So everything that you've done, everything that you've learned, all the skills that you've built and developed, create a brand new document and start cataloging all of this, and then mapping it to, where did you basically build that experience. Um, when you think about your resume, just like your essay is going to tell a story, make sure that your resume is telling a story, but that it is highlighting growth and impact. So it's showing the reader that you have been on this journey, that you are obviously a much different person now than you were when you first started your career, but that you have been continuing to grow and evolve. And if perhaps there was a lateral move or maybe a pivot or shift, that it is very clear in the resume what the value add of that pivot or that lateral move was. As I mentioned, use action verbs and numbers or percents to help convey impact. So wherever possible, data is incredibly powerful. And so make sure that you're leveraging data to really help tell your story best. As I mentioned, use the grandparent test. So at the end, make sure that you're sharing a copy of your resume with someone who maybe isn't as familiar with your industry or your job. And if your resume is fairly understandable and readable to them, then you can rest assured that it's probably going to pass it'll pass muster with an admissions officer as well. And then lastly, just take the time to make sure that your your essays and your resume are closely aligned. And what I mean by that is, your essays are going to touch on examples from your professional life. Certainly you want to make sure, if it is truly significant, you want to make sure that that is backed up somewhere and maybe documented in your resume, but you also don't want your resumes to be redundant. And so this is alluding to that last bullet on the right here, where you don't want there to be redundancies. Both of those documents or those assets should not be saying the exact same thing. And so make sure that you're saying something meaningful and very deliberate, but through slightly different lenses, whether it's on your resume or in your essays. Moving over to the don't side here. So as I mentioned before, just make sure that you are sticking to one page. I know folks sometimes do creative things with font size and with margins. Some schools I know actually do have requirements in terms of sort of what fonts you can or can't use and what size they should be. Part of schools are not doing this to be difficult. This really is an exercise in brevity and to see, can you really prioritize what are the things that you have done that are the most important that need to be shared? This is not in an effort to punish you as an applicant, I promise. As I mentioned, try to stay away from technical or industry specific jargon, and do not, above all, do not work on your resume last. Make sure that you are parallel tracking that. And then lastly, don't make any assumptions about the reader. So as I mentioned earlier, the admissions committee, more likely than not, they're going to know a good bit about your industry. These folks just sort of have to, based on the nature of their job and the types of applications they're reading year in and year out. But it's never safe to assume that they are going to either know much about your industry or more specifically your organization. So as I mentioned, if you are coming from an organization or have organizations on your resume, maybe that are a little bit lesser known, it certainly can't hurt to include some additional details there. And then just a quick note before we move on to Q&A about TTP's admissions consulting services. So we do offer a variety of different services. As you can see here, the most popular option is the school package. And that is essentially purchasing admissions support for 1 to 7 schools. It covers really everything sort of from start to finish. And what I mean by that is school strategy, school research, school engagement, letters of recommendation, obviously all of the ideation when it comes to essays, as well as multiple rounds of review on your essays, mock interview preparation, as well as guidance sort of post decision to help you sort of weigh your options and think about the best place to call home next year. The school packages, I think, are nice in many ways because they are unlimited. So you're not sitting there kind of counting hours and figuring out how to allocate hours. But for many folks, recognize that that you may be working within the confines of a certain budget, and so in that case, hourly consulting or a la carte can be a great option as well. And so for hourly, it works just as you might suspect. You purchase a set number of hours. There are bundle discounts for folks who purchase 10 or 20 hours at a time, and then that time can be allotted and divided up however you'd like to use it. And then finally, with a la carte, there are very application-specific services that you can buy, such as a complete review of your application, mock interview prep, ding strategy. This is something that can be popular for folks if you don't necessarily get the decision that you're hoping for in round one and want to regroup and sort of see where things may have gone off track before putting together your round two applications. This is a great opportunity to get some feedback from an experienced coach on what you might be able to rework or sort of optimize in the future. And then lastly, pre-application strategy and 2+2 strategy, as well as the mentorship bundle. So these are services that are geared more towards folks who are maybe 1 to 2 years out from applying. And so if you are either still an undergrad or maybe have fewer than 2 years of experience and are really looking at thinking about, if you know business schools in your future, but are trying to think about what are the things that I need to do to really put myself in the best position to be competitive. These are services and that can be a fantastic add-on or benefit as you're thinking through sort of how to help enhance or build out your profile over the next year or two. And as you can see here that we are offering a promotion during the month of June off of school packages only. And so there is a discount code here, and this is valid on all new school package purchases made before July 1st. Great. And with that, I'm going to pop in over to the chat and see. I think that wraps up our content. We've got about 10 minutes or so. So let's take a look and see what kind of questions folks had. So I'm going to try to roll some of these up into some broader themes because obviously we can. It's a little tough sometimes to sort of answer too specifically. But there are a handful of questions that are a bit similar. So there are some questions about if you've had jobs that are in different fields, should you include those? And I think that I would say the short answer is it depends. And so some of the comments that I made earlier about sort of length and sort of duration, I think would certainly come into play here. But if they are roles that are significant and where you spent a good bit of time, I would certainly include them. But I think I would try to focus as you're writing those bullets, try to reframe them and sort of focus on what is the work that you did? What are the results that you drove that then sort of maybe helped you? What are some of those, basically highlight the skills that helped you in sort of your next subsequent job or potentially that next pivot. There are always going to be skills that you build, I think, and develop in any role that are universal, and they're going to be easily transferable to other industries and to other jobs. And so if you made a complete 180 and pivoted to another field, I think one of the things that could be really helpful is to really sort of focus on what are the skills and what are the experiences that you had that you then took with you to that next job or industry. A great question around, is volunteer experience needed if your full-time job is in humanitarian work? And so I wouldn't necessarily say that you need to do volunteer work per se, but I do think it is still important to have extracurricular activities. Again, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier around why it's so important to be able to show a university that in a program that you have interests outside of your core day-to-day job. And so obviously humanitarian work is incredibly admirable. And it obviously is incredibly tough work as well. But I do think it is important to be able to show that you have other interests, again, that exist outside of your day-to-day job, because at the end of the day, if the humanitarian work is your full-time job and you are being compensated for that, again, it's good to understand what other things are you interested in as well. See, a couple questions about, will the recording or slides be available afterwards? Yes, there will be a recording afterwards. See here. There are, and let me say, there certainly are other examples we could certainly share. I wanted to highlight a couple of more common industries here, but if you do have questions about sort of your specific industry or your specific pivots, I would encourage you to take a look at our website. You can sign up and request a free consultation. We do 15-minute consultations. You just need to submit a copy of your resume, and then we can certainly chat through sort of any specific questions that you might have. Great question here around part-time jobs as well too. What I would say is I think that if it is relevant experience, I would certainly consider including it. But if it is less relevant, and if it is truly part-time, if it's maybe if it's retail or food industry, you don't necessarily need to include it again unless you are a little bit light on experience and looking for other ways to sort of build or flesh out your resume. Um, what I would say though is, if they were roles that you held, if you were between jobs, for example, so if you were laid off and you worked a handful of odd jobs, what I would consider trying to do is sort of roll those up into one larger category instead of itemizing them all, especially if you're talking about sort of over an extended period of time. Oh, great question. I should have mentioned this at the beginning. Someone asked about sort of a purpose or an objective at the head of the resume. So I will be honest, there are multiple schools of thought on this. What I would say is about this is that they can be helpful, but I think that if you do a good job in really being very succinct in the bullets that you are presenting with regards to your professional experience, I don't necessarily think that you need that to dedicate that real estate. I think that real estate, much like the interest in additional information, I think that real estate is probably far better served um, being devoted to an additional bullet when it comes to professional experience. What I find more often than not are those purpose statements or those objectives are a bit redundant. Everyone knows that you're an MBA candidate or that you're aspiring to be an MBA candidate. Otherwise, you wouldn't be applying to business school. And your essay is more likely than not, if you're looking to, if you're an aspiring MBA candidate who's looking to pivot from one industry to another, more likely than not, your essay is going to tell that story. And so I tend to err more on the side of leverage that real estate for something that is a bit more meaningful and a bit more specific. But again, I think that if many folks like to have that header, and I have seen some that have been very well done and that work well. But I would encourage folks to really think about what's the value that you're getting out of that. Some questions about volunteer work and extracurriculars and sort of the differences. And so I think that it's a good question. You can certainly list them together on your resume. I think it is important to note sort of then in the description, if you are under sort of under the role, if it is volunteer work, I certainly would sort of denote that. And volunteer work is going to be anything essentially that you're doing without getting paid. But I think that when you think about those activities, though, it's more, especially for extracurriculars. So, for example, if you've played in a kickball league and maybe were a captain of your undergrad university's kickball team for 4 years, um, you know, a lot of folks might laugh and say, well, I'm not sure what what skills you're building from playing kickball. But if you're managing the logistics and operations and dealing with team schedules and working within a league, again, I think there are a handful of very technical skills that you're likely going to be building. And sort of in experiences you're going to be curating sort of through that experience. So I certainly would think about sort of the quality of the experience and what sort of types of skills you're coming to the table with from those experiences. But you can certainly find ways to really highlight that and sort of bundle those together if need be. I will say some folks, if they do have considerable extracurricular volunteer work, they will separate that in a separate section, and you can certainly do that too. I think a lot of it is going to be very specific to the individual, though. Great questions about sort of promotions as well. And so one of the things, and we did not touch on this, one of the things that you can do is, and again, I think it depends on how long you've been in the role, but many individuals will list the roles separately, especially if there were different responsibilities within each of those roles, and then have sort of the appropriate bullets for each of those roles. Others will just sort of roll up all of the bullets, especially if it's a role or if it's an organization where the promotion comes with greater responsibility, but you still are, but some of the work is, maybe a little bit redundant or maybe similar. You can certainly just denote that you were promoted at a certain point, and then just make sure that you're including, denoting which bullets sort of apply to which role. Some questions about how far back you can go in terms of awards, accolades, experience. I would not recommend going back to beyond undergrad. So a couple of folks, it looks like we're asking here about, is it appropriate to include anything from high school? And I would not recommend including anything from high school. And again, I think even with undergrad, I would use your best judgment here. But the further removed you are from undergrad, the less relevant that experience becomes. And so I would really think, unless the work is very specific to what you are doing now or what you want to do in the future, I would really sort of err on the side of not including as much from undergrad. Again, unless it is directly relevant. It looks like we have some more questions about part-time. I think we addressed all of those. Oh, another question about sort of skills. So specifically things like certification or the sort of key skills. So, and I would say that, things that are things that really sort of demonstrate and sort of or indicate rigor. So things like a CFA designation, I think is certainly something that you should be including. But I'll be honest, I think one of the things that really takes up space is when folks include a line about technical skills and they include things like Google Suite or Microsoft Office. Or even, or more sort of generic type things, or indicate that they are, a key skill is social media guru or influencer. I would say anything that feels, again, kind of like what I was saying earlier about the if you can think of 5 or 10 people who have similar skill sets, then it's probably not a differentiator. I wouldn't include something unless it's I wouldn't include something like Google Suite or Microsoft Office. Those are just sort of givens at this point in the workplace that folks are going to be adept at those things. But I would think about if you have taken a very specific type of course, if you've completed maybe a nano degree or a micro credential or some type of certification, if you have certain coding skills or very, very specific technical skills. I would say for anyone working in finance, a lot of the software that you use for modeling is going to just be, whereas a consultant might not necessarily be using the type of software. Anyone in finance or in your role is going to. And so again, I would sort of check yourself and just think about, is this something that is going to help differentiate me from my competition, or is this something that is just for all intents and purposes kind of a given? So I think we have just a few minutes left here. Let me see. We've got a lot more questions coming in. Thank you. I'm so happy that folks are engaged and have questions about this. Let's see here. Again, questions on duration. So yes, again, part-time jobs and anything that was less than 3 months. Again, I would spend some time thinking about sort of what sort of the bullets would say, what was the impact. But by and large, anything less than 3 months, particularly if you're already struggling to try to fit everything on one page, is certainly is probably something that you can eliminate. The other thing that I did want to mention, actually in a similar vein, and it goes without saying, but I should say it just because not everyone does this, is before you apply and before you hit submit on your application, make sure that after you've spent all of this time reworking your resume and updating it to really be accurate for business school, make sure that you then go and do a side-by-side comparison with your LinkedIn resume. And all of your LinkedIn experience. It's basic things like just making sure all the dates match. But in terms of the bullets that you have there, if you have more specific detail on LinkedIn, I would go through and scrub it and make sure that it's just, again, it doesn't have to match your MBA resume exactly, but I would go through and just make sure that they are close enough so that if someone from a business school program were to go in and looked at your LinkedIn profile, it doesn't feel like they're reading profiles for 2 completely different people. So just make sure that you're going through and that you are aligned across the board when it comes to both LinkedIn and your resume itself. Great. Well, I think we are just about at time. I wanted to thank everyone again very much for joining today. A lot of great questions, a lot of great conversation here. Thank you so much. As I mentioned, if you have specific questions, certainly feel free to reach out and sign up for a consultation on the Target Test Prep site. And also, do you know that actually it probably goes without saying, but one of the a la carte services that TTP offers as well is a complete resume review as well. So if you have additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. But thank you so much for your time today. And it was a pleasure, and best of luck to you all.